Okay, if you'll be seated, we'll now have our main message, which, as I said, is a study that was written by Johann Lust, and it's titled Ezekiel 36 through 40 in the Oldest Greek Manuscript. And it was written in around 1981, I believe it was. Yeah, October 1981, it was published in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. I'm always a little bit skeptical of things coming out of the Catholic arena, but they do have, a lot of scholarly work that comes out of some of their theologians. And he's not necessarily a Catholic theologian. They just published the article. In Papyrus 967 Papyrus 967 dates from the 2nd or the early 3rd century AD. I did send this document to everyone, so you have it if you want to follow along. Makes it easier sometimes. I'm also sharing it on the screen, so if you want to just follow along there, that's fine too.
Hey Dave, that document only came up with like that first initial page, and then it had like a link to the website, but then I still couldn't find the actual document itself.
Okay.
Unless because it was very short, unless I'm missing something, I don't know.
All right, I will resend it.
Okay, thank you.
So this Papyrus 967 comes from the 2nd or the early 3rd century AD. It is the earliest witness of the pre-hexaplerik Septuagint of Ezekiel. Now you might be asking yourself, what's hexaplerik mean? Well, it comes from hexapla, which is an ancient Greek word meaning sixfold. And it's the term for a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible in 6 versions, 4 of them translated into Greek, preserved only in fragments. It was an immense and complex word-for-word comparison of the original Hebrew scriptures with the Greek Septuagint translation and with other Greek translations. The term especially and generally applies to the edition of the Old Testament compiled by the theologian and scholar Origen sometime before 240. So in case you were wondering what pre-hexaplerik means, now you know. It often supports the readings of Codex B, the other chief witness of the pre-hexaplerik text. Besides Ezekiel, it also contains Daniel, Susanna, Bel et Draco, and Esther, although the text of the latter books was written by another hand, so someone else wrote those. For his critical edition of the Septuagint of Ezekiel in 1952, J. Ziegler had at his disposal only the sections of the papyrus which were then published in the Chester Beatty Papyri and in the John H. Scheid Papyri. And recently, more pages of the same manuscript preserved respectively in Cologne and Madrid have been published. As a result, almost the complete text of this old Greek version of Ezekiel 11:25 through Ezekiel 48:35 is available. In an appendix to the new edition of J. Ziegler's Ezekiel, D. Frankel deals with these new discoveries and inserts them into the Apparatus Criticus. The Codex Wierceburgensis, or Bergensis, dates from the 6th century AD. It represents, together with Tychonius, the earliest and best preserved form of the Vetus Latina text of Ezekiel. Although this codex stands closer to Papyri 967 than the Old the other Old Latin witnesses, it's important to note that in its present form, it's not directly dependent upon the Greek papyrus. Most intriguing is that both manuscripts not only omit the same lengthy passage, which is Ezekiel 36:23c to Ezekiel 23:30 or Ezekiel 36:38, right? So that passage is missing in those manuscripts. But they also show a different ordering of chapters 36 through 40. There appears to be a connection between the omission of the passage and the changed sequence of the chapters. In discussions of the absence of 36:23c to 38, this reordering is usually overlooked. So a lot of the scholars don't even pay much attention to it. In both manuscripts, chapter 36 is followed by chapters 38 and 39, and the chapters with the famous battle scene against Gog and Magog. Chapter 37, with the well-known vision of the resurrection of the dry bones, is inserted between chapters 39 and 40. So it's our intention, A, to prove that the omission of this passage of Ezekiel 36:23c to 38 in both manuscripts is not accidental. B, to suggest that the passage in question was found neither in the earliest Septuagint of Ezekiel nor in its Hebrew vorlage. And this term the vorlage just simply means previous manuscripts or previous writings of the same vein. So it's Hebrew contemporary, right? And C, to show the link between the omission and the changed order. So first we'll look at A, which is no accidental omission of Ezekiel 36:23c through 38. So this wasn't by accident, and they're going to present evidence to that fact or that notion. So Ezekiel 36:23 through 38 is a widely known section because of its promise of a ritual cleansing and of the gift of a new heart and a new spirit. It says, I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. A new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will take out of your flesh the heart of stone, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to observe my ordinances. The passage as a whole, verses 23 through 38, is an intriguing composition. On the one hand, it presents a culmination of the prophet's theological thinking. On the other, it looks like a mere summary borrowing from the surrounding chapters. Its most famous thought, the gift of a new heart and a new spirit, is almost a literal repetition of Ezekiel 11:19. When W. Zimmerly wrote his commentary on Ezekiel 36, it was not yet certain whether 36:23c through 38 was included in Papyrus 967 or not. The section might have been preserved in one of the missing leaves. With the discovery of major parts of the manuscript in Madrid and Cologne, the uncertainty has disappeared. Papyrus 967 simply omits 36:23c through 38. At the end of his commentary, when he was writing the introduction, Zimmerly was able to mention this. However, he did not offer any further suggestions concerning this phenomenon. He merely adopted the opinion of F.G. Kenyon, who in 1938 had already concluded that the exact explanation is not clear. We may go at least one step further. it can now be accepted as proven that the omission of 3623c through 38 was not purely a scribal error. J.W. Weber's recent statement, based on F.V. Filson's argumentation, does not hold. He declares that Papyrus 967 omits from the end of the recognition formula in verse 23 to the end of verse 38 a parablepsis. All right, what's a parablepsis? So a parablepsis is a circumstance in which a scribe miscopies text due to inadvertently looking to the side while copying or accidentally skips over some of it. So it's just an accident in a scribal mishap, if you will. So it omits from the end of the recognition formula in verse 23 to the end of verse 38 by parablepsis, both parts ending in know that I am, and here he uses the term Yahweh, but we know it to be Yehovah. We have to agree with Weber's and Filson that Papyrus 967 has many omissions through parablepsis caused by homoi oteluton. Okay, now what's that mean? They got a lot of big terms in here for the overly educated, I guess. Homoi telutin means a like ending. Is the repetition of endings in words. Homotelutin is also known as near rhyme. So it's something close, but not the same. However, this is not a sufficient reason to consider the omission of 3623c through 38 as one of them. So not a rhyme or not an scribal mishap. So they present some data here, and he says the following data advise against it. 1. The omission of 3623c38 can hardly be put on a par with a current type of omission in the manuscript. With A.C. Johnson, one should note that a long omission such as 3623c through 38, amounting to 1,451 letters, is very unusual. The longest omission known through parablepsis in the papyrus appears to add up to 266 letters, which is 1226 through 28. And the average is plus or minus 20 letters. In most of these cases, the homotelutin is more evident than in 3623b through 38. 2. If the omission had been caused by a single homotelutin, and forgive my pronunciation, I don't know if that's correct or not, the manuscript should have continued with the next verse, which is 37:1, in the traditional order of the book. However, the scribe of Papyrus 967 jumps immediately to 38:1, putting chapter 37 after chapters 38 and 39. This means at least that one cannot consider the omission of 3623c to 38 on its own. It has to be considered together with the transposition of chapter 37. And 3, the omission of 3623c through 38 followed by the transposition of chapter 37 is not attested only in Papyrus 967. The same phenomena occur in the Codex Wierceburgensis, notwithstanding the important Lucanae in the manuscript. Now, this means this is essentially an unfilled space or interval, a gap, right? So, notwithstanding the important gap in the manuscript, this has been clearly demonstrated in a recent article by P.M. Bogart. we may conclude that 3623c through 38 was not omitted by accident, and that even the most absent-minded scribe would not have easily overlooked a passage with such theological richness. Moving on to goal B, which is absent from the Vorlage. Vorlage, again, meaning it's from German for prototype or template. It's a prior version or manifestation of a text under consideration. A lot of fancy words. The style and terminology, and again, here we go, of the pericope, all right, which is an extract from a text, especially a passage from the Bible. So this excerpt in question display a series of peculiar characteristics, atypical of the book of Ezekiel. This could explain why the copyist in Papyrus 967 did not take it up in his manuscript. He did not know it, since it was neither attested in the Greek manuscript, which he was copying, nor in its Hebrew Vorlage. So it wasn't in the Greek, and it wasn't in the Hebrew. And that's why it didn't end up in his manuscript. A closer look first at the Greek text and then at the Hebrew will illustrate this statement. So first, the style and terminology of 3623c through 38 in the present text of the Septuagint differ materially from that of the rest of the book. And this was demonstrated by the Honorable St. J. Thackeray a long time before the discovery of Papyrus 967. 2 samples out of many may suffice here. Right? So in verse 24, the Hebrew word kibbes, or kibbis, to gather, is rendered by, and this is Greek and I don't read Greek, so rendered by that Greek word there, whereas elsewhere in Ezekiel, it is translated by this other Greek word, 5 times, translator A, or by a different Greek word, 7 times by translator B. And this Greek word here is the rendering of Theodotion in his book, verse 20, or chapter 20, verse 34, and elsewhere. In verses 33 and 37, Papyrus 967 transliterates Hebrew Adonai. It is well known that the expression Adonai, Yehovah, occurs very often in the Hebrew text, some 217 times. In the Greek Codex B, it is most often rendered by a single or a repeated Kyrios. Only in 36, 33, and 37 does Codex B have Adonai. This transliteration of the Hebrew is typical for the later Greek translators, for Theodotion and the Asiatic school. The scribes of Codex B were not familiar with this technique, so they didn't do that. These and similar remarks led Honorable St. J. Thackeray to the conclusion that the actual Septuagint translation of Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 was borrowed from another version resembling that of Theodotion. Any further interpretation of this fact may remain tenuous. The fact itself appears to be certain. 36:23c through 38 in this text of the Septuagint is not from the same hand as the surrounding sections. This supports the view that the scribe of Papyrus 967 did not overlook the section in question. He simply did not find it in the manuscript he was copying. Number 2, the special features of this passage confined to the Greek are not confined to the Greek, sorry. The Hebrew text itself shows quite a few peculiarities, and hapax legomena, all right? What's that? Hapax legomena is sometimes abbreviated to hapax, or plural hapaxes, is a word or an expression that occurs only once within a context, either in the written record of an entire language, in the works of an author, or in a single text. So that means it only appears once, and that's peculiar. And these peculiarities in hapax legomena require an explanation. These phenomena, taken on their own, are not really extraordinary. Other prophetic passages display similar ones. Indeed, one should not be amazed when a prophet does not always use the same vocabulary, right? We don't always use the same words when we write. Remarkable, however, is that the pericope in question, this particular excerpt of Scripture in question, has the character of an anthology, right? It's a compilation of things. Most of its expressions are to be found elsewhere in Ezekiel. In such a pericope, one does not expect to find so many of these hapax legomena. Which is the fact that that word, a particular word, only appears once. The best example is to be found in verse 28. Only here do we read the longer form of the first personal pronoun, anoki. Everywhere else in the book, the shorter form, ani, occurs. It has often been overlooked that the longer form is attested in exactly the same context in Jeremiah. They will be my people, and I, Anoki, will be their God. The sections in question are usually considered Deuteronomistic, sorry. The redactor or editor of Ezekiel 36, 23c through 38 leans heavily on Deutero-Jeremiah, more so than the editors of the rest of the book. Other examples will confirm this. In the same verse, 28, we read, "The land which I gave to your fathers." Now this is a favorite expression of Deutero-Jeremiah. The closest parallel in Ezekiel is in 37:25a, where it is said that the land was given to Jacob. In verse 31, evil conduct, which is ma'alal, is employed as a synonym for evil ways, which is darakim ra'im. In the immediately preceding verses, a variant is used as a parallel for evil ways, alila. This variant is the more current term in Ezekiel, whereas ma'alal is more typical of Jeremiah. Right? So you see the words don't fit into Jeremiah or Ezekiel's writings. They appear more akin to Jeremiah's writings. The conjunction tahat aser in verse 34 is a hapax legomenon in Ezekiel. In Jeremiah, it occurs slightly more often, right? So this term tahat aser occurs more often in Jeremiah and only once in Ezekiel. The rare adjective hareb, dry, is used in Ezekiel only in 36, 35, and 38. In Jeremiah, it is attested in 33, 10, and 12. This late redactional editorial chapter in Jeremiah shows more affinities with this text in Ezekiel. The combination of the verb to cleanse with the object iniquities, or awan, is to be found only in Ezekiel 36:33 and Jeremiah 33:8. In verse 36, the expression, I have rebuilt what was destroyed and replanted what was ruined, is clearly inspired by Jeremiah. Indeed, the combination of the verbs to destroy and to build and to plant is typical for Jeremiah and occurs nowhere else in Ezekiel. Especially this example suggests that the editor of 36:23c through 38 must have been familiar with Jeremiah's way of speaking. Especially this example, other hapax legomena are legion, many. Verse 25 is the only instance in the Bible where God is said to pour, or zarach, clean water over his people. The expression to pour water, zarach ma'im, is attested only here and in Numbers 19:13 and verse 20. Its use in Ezekiel 36:25 is most probably inspired by Ezekiel 36:17, where the guilty conduct of the people is compared with the uncleanness of menstruation, tumat hanida, which calls to mind Numbers 19:13 and 20, where the uncleanness of a person, tumato, is to be cleansed by the water for impurity, manida, poured or zarach over him. In the same verse 25 and also in verse 29, the uncleanness of the people is rendered by the plural tuma, whereas elsewhere in Ezekiel, the singular is current. The editor probably tried too hard to be faithful to Ezekiel's style, knowing that the prophet often used plural forms when rendering abstract notions, but overlooking the fact that he never did so in this context. In verse 27, the construction, I will bring it about that, which is we asiti et asur, followed by a subordinate clause expressing a purpose or a consequence, is unusual in the Bible and certainly unique in Ezekiel. The editor was led to this clumsy construction when, in the middle of a quotation from Ezekiel 11:19 through 20, he inserted a short phrase about God's Spirit, preparing for chapter 37. In using the verb to make, he may have been influenced by 36:22. In verse 29, one reads that God will never again give Natan or famine, give Natan, famine, Ra'ab, to his people. So the word give is Natan and famine is Ra'ab. Elsewhere in Ezekiel, it is said that God, quote unquote, sends, or salah, famine. Sends, which is salah, famine, which is Ra'ab, right? So it's different words in play. And you see that in 5:15 and 16 and 14:13. More important is the use of the emphatic pronoun helezu in verse 35. This helezu land, this helezu land, the emphatic form of the pronoun helezu is attested nowhere else in the Bible and appears to belong to post-biblical Hebrew. So more evidence that the language is different. And this is similar to what Nehemiah Gordon has done with the book of Jasher, comparing the language of the time with what is in the book of Jasher doesn't match. And so he's proven by comparing the language that the book of Jasher that we have today is not the book of Jasher referenced in Scripture. It's quite an interesting study. Finally, in verse 37, we find an expression which seems typical of Ezekiel. Idaris le. However, in the more original sections of the book, this expression is used in a context of consultation. I will not let them consult. 14:3, 20, verse 3 and 31. In Ezekiel 36:37, it has another meaning. God lets his people ask him, DRSL, to do something, right? In one, he says not to let them consult. And here he says he's letting them do it. To this series of hapax legomena and of connections with Jeremiah, we may add a number of special expressions which show a literary connection between Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 and some other pluses of the Masoretic text absent from the Septuagint and the Vetus Latina. P.M. Bogart has drawn my attention to these phenomena. A, in 34:31, the Masoretic text has Adam etin, you are men, in addition to you are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture. The addition you are men is absent from both the Septuagint and the Vetus Latina, Codex Sengalensis. The similarity with Ezekiel 36:37, Kason, Adam, like a flock of men, is remarkable. Again, these texts were added. B, the notion of increase, Rabbah, attested 3 times in Ezekiel 36:29, 30, and 37, is also found in 36:10 through 11 and 37:26 in the Masoretic text. Again, in both cases, the Septuagint and the Vetus Latina have shorter text forms. So the language is not the same. So it appears to be added. And C, Ezekiel 34:13 is much longer in the Masoretic text than it is in the Septuagint and the Vetus Latina. The pluses appear to be introduced verses 25 and 29 in chapter 36 with their emphasis on the cleansing of the uncleanness. We may conclude that Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 is most probably a late editorial addition, both in the Hebrew text and in the traditional Greek version. The style and the vocabulary of the passage betray a hand different from the one in the surrounding parts of the book. The editor appears to have been inspired by the book of Jeremiah in its final form. Moreover, his language shows some characteristics which are rather typical of a later period. His hand can also be recognized in some of the pluses of the Masoretic text. Zimmerle's objections against such a conclusion are not convincing. The fact that verse 32 forms an inclusio with verse 22 does not argue in favor of the original unity of verses 16 through 32. It rather suggests that the editor wished to connect his composition, verses 23c following, with the foregoing section. The similar inclusio in Ezekiel 20 verses 1 through 31, adduced by Zimmerle in support of his view, proves exactly the opposite. Indeed, the inclusio in chapter 20 serves to connect the edited or editorial section of verses 27 through 29 with the preceding composition. Right, so there's these bits of text called an inclusio which which are transitional from one section of Scripture to another. Zimmerli further objects that the oracle in verses 16 through 23b gives the impression of being fragmentary. It cries out for a continuation. However, the recognition formula followed by Neum Yehovah in verse 23b makes a good conclusion to be compared with the conclusion of 25:12 through 14. The continuation in verse 23 following, on the other hand, is unusual. As a further confirmation of verses 16 through 23b as an independent unit, one may refer to the Coptic Sahidic manuscripts published by A. Ehrman. It contains 3 complete oracles from Ezekiel, the last of which is precisely chapter 36, verses 16 through 23b. One should remember that the Coptic Sahidic version is a very early and often trustworthy witness to the text. All this permits us to confirm our hypothesis. The scribe of Papyrus 967 did not find chapter 36, verses 23c through 38 in the manuscript he was copying. Moreover, it probably was not part of the Hebrew vorlage, or the Hebrew version of that text. Something similar can be said about the scribe of the Codex Worciabergensis. Boy, that's terrible. The minus in Papyrus 967 and in the Vetus Latina Codex goes along with a different ordering of chapters 36 through 40. In the next part, we shall try to demonstrate that the redactor or editor composed 36:23c through 38 as a link between Ezekiel 36 and 37. In the ordering of Papyrus 967, where Ezekiel 37 follows upon 38 and 39, there was no use for the link. See, because they reordered it, they had to link it, is what he's saying there. So let's look at this link between Ezekiel 36 and 37. As I said, this word anthology means a published collection of poems or other pieces of writing. So it's a group of writing, if you will. Excuse me. So Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 is to a large extent an anthology or a group of expressions found elsewhere in Ezekiel or in Jeremiah. These are assembled so as to introduce chapter 37. This is the clearest in verses 26 through 27, where apart from some minor exceptions, there is a literal correspondence with Ezekiel 11:19 through 20. In both passages, God promises to give his people a new heart and a new spirit. He will take away their heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. Here in 36:27, the editor adds that God will give him his spirit. After this rather redundant insertion, he returns to the text of 11:19 through 20. Through this intervention, the editor appears to introduce directly the line of thought found especially in Ezekiel 37:14, where God is said to give his spirit to the people. Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 prepares not only for the first part of chapter 37 with the gift of the Spirit, but also for the second with its description of Israel's future unification. In both 37:24 following and in 36:37, Israel's salvation is depicted in terms of sheep and flock. Its deliverance is described with a stereotyped formula often used by Ezekiel. I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. It should be noted that only in 36:24 and 37:21 is exactly the same triad of verbs used. Take, which is lakha, gather, which is kebes, and bring, which is hebi. The first verb is especially unusual. Elsewhere, it is replaced by to bring out, hosi, or to assemble, asa. The variant to take, lakha, is owing to the immediate context in 37:15 following. There, the prophet is given the command to take or lakha, 2 sticks representing Israel and Judah, respectively. The interpretation in verse 21 explains that in a similar way, God will take, or lakha, his people from the nations, or goyim. The use of goyim in this context is also exceptional, being limited to 36:24 and 37:21. Elsewhere, one finds the term amim, or peoples. Again, this is to be explained by the context of 37:22, where we read that God will make his people one nation, or goy, and no longer 2 nations, or goyim. The examples given above show clearly that Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 was inspired by chapter 37 and not vice versa. Right? So they looked at 37 and they looked at 36 and they added a passage to make an easy transition from one to the other. Other expressions are, or almost are, exclusively used in 36:23c through 38 and in chapter 37. The deliverance of the people is preceded by a purification. You can see that in 36:25 and 37:28, or 23, sorry. The effects of the purification are that the people shall follow God's ordinances and be careful to observe his statutes, from 36:27 and 37:24. They will possess the land, 36:28 to 37:25. They will be the people of Yehovah, and he will be their God, 36:28 and 37:23. So you see the similar language put in there in this passage to make the easy transition. Their uncleanness and idols, 36:25, 37:23, shall no longer affect them. The above indications confirm the close relationship between 36:23c through 38 and chapter 37. 2. The link between 36:23c through 38 and the preceding passages is equally clear. We have already noted the connection between the sprinkling of clean water in verse 25 with the uncleanness of a woman in her impurity in verse 17. Ezekiel 36:32 says, "It is not for your sake that I will act." This repeats in 36:22. This repetition reinforces the link between the 2 sections, right? So they took a little passage from an earlier bit and moved it into this section. Again, right now bringing 36 into 37. The next verse, 36:33, resumes a theme from the beginning of the chapter. I will cause the cities to be inhabited and the waste places shall be rebuilt. Verse 36 mentions the nations that are left round about you. Elsewhere in Ezekiel, reference is made to the nations round about you. And you can see that in chapter 5, verse 7 and chapter 11, verse 12. However, the editor of 36:23c through 38 knows that since the events described in the foregoing excerpts of Scripture, only a remnant of the nations is left from 36:3 and 4 and 5. He combines both ideas, the nations round about you and the nations that are left. There can hardly be any doubt that Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 was composed as a link between chapters 36 and 37. This becomes even more probable when you turn once more to the absence of the passage in Papyrus 967. 3. In Papyrus 967, there is no place for 36:23c through 38. If it had been there as a conclusion to chapter 36, it would have been followed by chapters 38 and 39 according to the ordering of this manuscript. The passage in question would not have suited this context. Indeed, the beginning of chapter 38 describes Israel's peaceful existence, or Labatah, from 38:8 and 11. They dwell in unfortified cities without walls, in verse 11. And this idea was already prepared for in Ezekiel 34:27 through 28. It is, however, contradicted by 36:35, where the fortification of Israel's cities is announced. Moreover, none of the other themes in 36:23c through 38 prepares for or introduces chapters 38 or 39, and the vocabulary differs to a large extent. 4. This leads us to the conclusion that the original Septuagint was probably based on a Hebrew text where chapter 36 was followed by chapters 38, 39, and then by chapter 37. In this ordering of the book, there was no place for 36:23 through 38. The excerpt was composed for another, probably later, Hebrew text with a different order. This Hebrew text became the accepted Masoretic text. In a revision of the Septuagint, the Greek version was adapted to the new Hebrew text. This required a special translation of 36:23c through 38, since this section had not been taken up in the earlier version. And this explains why this passage betrays the hand of a translator different from the ones responsible for the other chapters. The revision in question is most likely attributable to the so-called Asiatic school. If it is true that the original Septuagint version was based on a Hebrew text differing from the Masoretic text, then this is no exception. A similar phenomenon can be found in Jeremiah and Daniel, the two prophetic books which surround Ezekiel in the Septuagint. The phenomenon is best known with regard to Jeremiah. The Greek text of Jeremiah is shorter than the Hebrew one, and the order is different. A growing consensus holds that the Hebrew vorlage, or the contemporary Hebrew text to the Greek, of the Septuagint of Jeremiah represents an older text form than the Masoretic text. The Septuagint of Daniel is not so well known. The text has been preserved in very few manuscripts. The best copy is again Papyrus 967. In this manuscript, the Greek text is shorter than that of the Masoretic text. Remarkable is that the order is also different. A further analysis of the ordering of the book of Ezekiel may confirm the thesis that the Septuagint text of Papyrus 967 reflects an early edition of the Hebrew, differing from the later Masoretic edition. The reordering underlying the Masoretic text may be owing to theological motivations. The following paragraphs offer a tentative elaboration of these suggestions. So we'll look at some of these possible theological motivations. The ordering of the chapters 36 through 40 in Ezekiel. The ordering of the chapters in Ezekiel is not accidental. Of course, order, according to the mentality of the ancient Near East, is not necessarily identical with the Greek or with current Western conceptions. Nevertheless, Old Hebrew writings always show a certain arrangement of the materials. One of the main principles governing the organization of a book, such as Ezekiel, was that of arranging sections by an association of ideas or words. In this, we agree with Yu Kasudo. However, there was probably more to this arrangement. At a certain stage in the composition of the book of Ezekiel, the order was not only dependent upon such associations, but the continuity of thought also played a role. With this in mind, we turn to the order of chapters 36 through 40 in Papyrus 967, i.e. 36, then 38 through 39, then 37, then 40 through 48. In this manuscript, the excerpt of Gog and Magog follows upon chapters 35 through 36. Both sections are clearly linked together by catchwords. The chosen people are addressed by God as the mountains of Israel in 35:12, 36:1 through 8, and 39:8, and as my land. The second address occurs only here in Ezekiel, i.e. in 36:5 and 38:16. The same is true for the general term with which Israel's enemies are named, Oyed. We see that in 36:2 and 39:27. However, both passages are connected not only by these few words, there is also a thematic unity, right? So not only are they using similar words, but the theme is seamless. And you see that in 36:8 following, which describes the peaceful restoration of Israel. The beginning of chapter 38 takes this as its starting point. Israel dwells securely in its land at the eve of the final battle against Magog, 38:8 and 11. In this final event, God will vindicate the holiness of his name, 38:16 and then 39:25 through 27. This important theme of chapters 38 and 39 is obviously connected with the central motif of 36:16 through 23. God's name has been profaned by his people and is to be sanctified. Comes from 36:20 following. But these themes and the special terminology of the two passages are lacking in 36:23c through 38. More evidence that it was added. Chapter 37 follows upon 39. Here again we find catchwords as well as a continuous development of the thought. Indeed, the end of chapter 39 mentions the gift of God's Spirit and thus introduces chapter 37, where the theme of the gift of the Spirit is developed. Moreover, chapter 39 describes the end of Gog and his army. Their bones are strewn all over the battlefield until they are buried in the valley of Hamon Gog. Chapter 37 offers a good continuation of this scene. It draws attention to the dry bones and tombs of Israel. Apparently, both chapters are considered as two panels of a diptych. Well, what's a diptych? It's a painting, especially an altarpiece, on two hinged wooden panels, which may be closed like a book. They describe the situation after the final war. Chapter 39 shows the fate of the enemy, and chapter 37 that of the people of Israel. The end of chapter 37 offers a good introduction to chapters 40 through 48. It promises the restoration of the temple. The fulfillment of this promise is pictured in the vision of these chapters. It should be noted in this context that nowhere else in Ezekiel is the rebuilding of the temple mentioned. the content of both chapters is very concordant. Both visualize the revival of Israel after the final battle. Chapter 37 gives the vision of the resurrection of its people, and chapters 40 through 48 sketch the reorganization of its state and its temple. Chapters 36 through 48 clearly manifest a logical composition. In the editor's view, it was a description of the final events. The traditional text, however, presents a different picture. The promise of the sanctification of God's name in 36, 1 through 23 is followed by the vision of the dry bones. Words linking both passages together are very few in number. In between both sections, however, one finds 36:23c through 38. A passage almost entirely composed of expressions tying together the surrounding sections. From the point of view of contents, however, the link remains very tenuous. The promise of the sanctification of God's holy name, the main theme of chapter 36, does not find a fulfillment in Ezekiel 37, and it is not clear why Israel is suddenly described in chapter 37 as a valley of bones. Israel's resurrection and reunification in chapter 37 leads to the final battle in chapters 38 and 39. An associative link between these chapters is very weak or even non-existent. The vision of the new temple and the new Israel in chapters 40 through 48 follows without any transition. We may conclude that the ordering of the traditional text is less logical, both according to Eastern as well as Western norms. A vague general maxim holds that the less logical form of the text has more chance to be the older one. The more logical ordering is then supposed to be the work of a later editor. General rules like this stand on a very weak footing. An originally more logical order could have been destroyed through a later corruption of the text or changed for theological reasons. The Book of Enoch illustrates this very well. The Aramaic manuscripts found at Qumran offer a more logical order of the chapters describing the apocalypse of the 10 weeks than the other more recent manuscripts. 2, a theological motivation. If we admit that the order of Papyrus 967 was the more original, why was it changed and why was 3623c through 38 added? The motivation may have been a theological one. In this section, we shall try to offer some suggestions along this line. Yet these suggestions are bound to be hypothetical, owing to gaps in our information. So these are hypotheses, not facts. In the days of Ezekiel and his school, the chronological order of the events described in the final chapters of the book probably did not arouse much interest. The oracles about the Battle of Gog were considered as an appendix to the first volume, and the vision of the dry bones as a preface to the second. These chapters were not read as a continuous story. The situation changed when apocalyptic tendencies grew stronger. The order of the last events received more attention. The apocalyptic groups expected a final battle to be followed by a resurrection of the elect, the coming of the Son of Man, and the foundation of an ideal heavenly Israel. Differing opinions circulated as to the exact sequence of these final events. One thing is sure, the totally corrupted earthly history had to come to an end. A new heavenly era had to succeed it. The apocalypticists probably saw their expectations reflected in the final chapters of Ezekiel. In the combat against Gog, they recognized the final battle at the end of days. In the vision of the dry bones, they saw the announcement of the resurrection and of the coming Messiah. In the vision of the temple and the reorganized state, they discovered a preview of the new heavenly Israel. A similar view of the final events can be found in their own apocalyptic writings. Only one of them was accepted in the biblical canon, the book of Daniel. There too, the last battle is followed by a resurrection. You see that in Daniel 12:1 following. There was a reaction against this apocalyptic view of life among the Pharisees, who preferred a more realistic political view. When they came to power, they enforced their policy, which is why further apocalyptic writings were excluded from the canon, with the exception of Daniel, accepted earlier. The Pharisees may be responsible for the restructuring of the book of Ezekiel. According to their view, the restoration of Israel and the coming of the Messiah would precede the final events. All of this belonging to the history of the world. In this perspective, the vision of the dry bones had to follow upon the oracles relating Israel's exile. It referred to the restoration of Israel after its captivity and not to a resurrection strictly speaking. It is not ruled out that a confrontation between Pharisees and Christians influenced this reorganization of the book of Ezekiel. Indeed, it is well known that Christians recognized in Ezekiel 37 a prefiguring of the bodily resurrection, of which the resurrection of Christ was the final realization. One can imagine that Pharisees would have disliked this interpretation. It was not that they themselves denied the possibility of a resurrection, but that they did not like the idea of being taught by Christians. This may have been an additional reason for stressing the figurative meaning of chapter 37. The author of the Apocalypse in the New Testament probably knew both traditions. In his Baroque description of the final events inspired by Ezekiel, he combines both schemes. He therefore inserts a resurrection before the final battle against Gog and Magog and another one after his battle. So in conclusion, our main conclusions can be summarized as follows. 1. The omission of Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 in Papyrus 967 is not owing to parablepsis or scribal error or mishap. The fact that this passage is missing has to be understood in relation to the sequence of chapters 36 through 40 in the same papyrus. 2. Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 was not found in the earliest text of the Septuagint, nor in its Vorlage or Hebrew contemporary. The special linguistic character of these verses shows this. And 3, Ezekiel 36:23c through 38 was composed of a transition between chapters 36 and 37. The piece would have had no function in an earlier edition of the text in which chapter 37 followed 39, not 36. So, with that in mind, what I'd like to do is read it in its proposed format, starting with Ezekiel 36:1. We'll read Ezekiel 36 through 39, actually with 37 at the end of 39. He says, "And you, son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yehovah. Thus says Adonai Yehovah, because the enemy said of you, Aha, and the ancient heights have become our possession. Therefore prophesy and say, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, precisely because they made you desolate and crushed you from all sides, so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations, and you became the talk of evil gossip of the people. Therefore, O mountains of Israel, Hear the word of Adonai Yehovah. Thus says Adonai Yehovah to the mountains and the hills, the ravines and the valleys, the desolate wastes and the deserted cities, which have become a prey and a derision to the rest of the nations all around. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yehovah, surely I have spoken in my hot jealousy against the rest of the nations and against all Edom, who have my land, who gave my land to themselves as a possession with wholehearted joy and utter content, that they might make its pasture lands a prey. Therefore prophesy concerning the land of Israel, and say to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I have spoken in my jealous wrath, because you have suffered the reproach of the nations. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yehovah, I swear that the nations that are all around you shall themselves suffer reproach. But you, O mountains of Israel, shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel. For they will soon come home. For behold, I am for you, and I will turn to you, and you shall be tilled and sown. And I will multiply people on you, the whole house of Israel, all of it. The cities shall be inhabited, and the waste places rebuilt. And I will multiply on you man and beast, and they shall multiply and be fruitful. And I will cause you to be inhabited, as in your former times, and will do more good to you than ever before. Then you will know that I am Yehovah. I will let people walk on you, even my people Israel, and they shall possess you, and you shall be their inheritance, and you shall no longer bereave them of children. Thus says Adonai Yehovah, because they say to you, you devour people, and you bereave your nation of children. Therefore you shall no longer devour people, and no longer bereave your nation of children, declares Adonai Yehovah. And I will not let you hear any more the reproach of the nations, and you shall no longer bear the disgrace of the peoples, and no longer cause your nation to stumble, declares Adonai Yehovah. The word of Yehovah came to me. Son of man, verse 17. When the house of Israel lived in their own land, they defiled it by their ways and their deeds. Their ways before me were like the uncleanness of a woman in her menstrual impurity. So I poured out my wrath upon them for the blood that they had shed in the land, for the idols with which they had defiled it. I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed through the countries. In accordance with their ways and their deeds I judged them. But when they came to the nations, wherever they came, they profaned my holy name. In that people said of them, these are the people of Yehovah, and yet they had to go out of his land. But I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations to which they came. Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says Adonai Yehovah, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came. Right? So Israel went to these nations, right, where he sent them. And they knew that the Israelites were the people of God. And they behaved in such ways that profaned his name. And so he's going to act to restore honor to his name. Therefore, say to the house of Israel, verse 22, thus says Adonai Yehovah, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations which you came, and I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations which you have profaned among them. Right? So now we eliminate 23c, right? And I'm kind of guessing about where C is. There's not really a defined method for determining that. And so now we move from chapter 36 into chapter 38. The word of Yehovah came to me, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great host, all of them with buckler and shield, wielding swords. Persia, Cush, and Put are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his hordes. Beth Togarmah from the uttermost parts of the north with all his hordes. Many peoples are with you. Verse 7, Be ready and keep ready, you and all your hosts that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance, coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes, and many peoples with you. Thus says Adonai Yehovah, on that day thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme, and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates, to seize spoil and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell at the center of the earth, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders will say to you, Have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your hosts to carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to seize great spoil? Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say to Gog, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, on that day when my people Israel are dwelling securely, will you not know it? You will come from your place out of the uttermost parts of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great host, a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. In the latter days I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. Right? Remember, he was talking about doing this to restore honor to his name. He's vindicating his holiness before their eyes. Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Are you he of whom I spoke in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who in those days prophesied for years that I would bring you against them? But on that day, the day that Gog shall come against the land of Israel, declares Adonai Yehovah, my wrath will be roused in my anger. For in my jealousy and in my blazing wrath I declare, on that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea, and the birds of the heavens, and the beasts of the field, and all creeping things that creep on the ground, and all the people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence. And the mountains shall be thrown down, and the cliffs shall fall, and every wall shall tumble to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares Adonai Yehovah. Every man's sword will be against his brother. With pestilence and bloodshed I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain upon him and his hordes, and with many peoples who are with him, torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. So I will show my greatness and my holiness, and make myself known in the eyes of many nations. Then they will know that I am Yehovah. And now we go into 39. And you, son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about and drive you forward, and bring you up from the uttermost parts of the north, and lead you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand, and will make your arrows drop out of your right hand. You shall fall on the mountains of Israel, you and all your hordes, and the peoples who are with you. I will give you to birds of prey of every sort, and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. You shall fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares Adonai Yehovah. I will send fire on Magog and all those who dwell securely in the coastland, and they shall know that I am Yehovah. In my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned any more. And the nations shall know that I am Yehovah, the Holy One of Israel. Behold, it is coming, and it will be brought about, declares Adonai Yehovah. That is the day of which I have spoken. Then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and make fires of the weapons and burn them, shields and bucklers, bows and arrows, clubs and spears, and they will make fires of them for 7 years, so that they will not need to take wood out of the field or cut down any out of the forest, for they will make their fires of the weapons. They will seize the spoil of those who despoiled them, and plunder those who plundered them, declares Adonai Yehovah. On that day I will give to Gog a place for burial in Israel, the valley of the travelers east of the sea. It will block the travelers, for there Gog and all his multitude will be buried. It will be called the valley of Hamon Gog. For 7 months the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land will bury them, and it will bring them renown on the day that I show my glory, declares Adonai Yehovah. They will set apart men to travel through the land regularly and bury those travelers remaining on the face of the land, so as to cleanse it. So it appears that God is going to muster Gog, Magog, and all their hordes against the nations of Israel. And as they invade Israel, God is going to hammer them. He's going to stop them. And in so doing, the whole earth is going to then know who he is. All of the people of the land will bury them, and it will bring them renown on the day that I show my glory, declares Adonai Yehovah. They will set apart men to travel through the land regularly and bury those travelers remaining on the face of the earth, so as to cleanse it. At the end of 7 months, they will make their search. And when these travel through the land and anyone sees a human bone, then he shall set up a sign by it, till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamon Gog. Hamona is also the name of the city. Thus shall they cleanse the land. As for you, son of man, thus says Adonai Yehovah, speak to the birds of every sort and all beasts of the field. Assemble and come gather from all around to the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel, and you shall eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty, and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of he-goats, of bulls, and all of them fat beasts of Bashan. And you shall eat fat till you are filled, and drink blood till you are drunk, at the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you. And you shall be filled at my table with horses and charioteers, with mighty men and all kinds of warriors, declares Adonai Yehovah. And I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid on them. The house of Israel shall know that I am Yehovah their Elohim from that day forward. And the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they dealt so treacherously with me that I hid my face from them and gave them into the hand of their adversaries, and they all fell by the sword. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their transgressions, and hid my face from them. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yehovah, now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob, and have mercy on the whole house of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. They shall forget their shame and all the treachery they have practiced against me, when they dwell securely in their land, with none to make them afraid. When I have brought them back from the peoples and gathered them from their enemies' lands, and through them have vindicated my holiness in the sight of many nations. Then they shall know that I am Yehovah their Elohim, because I sent them into exile among the nations, and then assembled them into their own land. I will leave none of them remaining among the nations any more, and I will not hide my face any more from them. When I pour out my spirit upon the house of Israel, declares Adonai Yehovah. And now we transition into 37. The hand of Yehovah was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of Yehovah, and set me down in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones, and he led me around among them. And behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Adonai Yehovah, you know. Then he said to me, Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of Yehovah. Thus says Adonai Yehovah to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. And you shall know that I am Yehovah. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, there was a sound, and behold, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I looked, and behold, there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them. But there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of man, and say to the breath, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied, and he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. And he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are indeed cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will bring you into the land of Israel, and you shall know that I am Yehovah, when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you into your own land. Then you shall know that I am Yehovah. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares Yehovah. The word of Yehovah came to me, Son of man, take a stick and write on it for Judah and the people of Israel associated with him. Then take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him, and join them one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. And when your people say to you, Will you not tell us what you mean by these? Say to them, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I am about to take the stick of Joseph that is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel associated with him, and I will join it with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, that they may be one in my hand. Then the sticks on which you write, when the sticks on which you write are in your hand before their eyes, then say to them, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone, and will gather them from all around, and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. And one king shall be king over them all, and they shall be no longer two nations, and no longer divided into two kingdoms. They shall not defile themselves any more with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions. But I will save them from all the backslidings in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever. And David, my servant, shall be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will set them in their land and multiply them, and I will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Then the nations will know that I am Yehovah, who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. Amen to that. So it does seem to flow logically in my mind with 37 at the end of 39. So it does appear that, quite plausible anyway, that the order has been modified and that this section of Ezekiel 36, 23 through 38 was added to give cohesiveness to the new order. So I thought it was an interesting study. Hopefully you found it at least intriguing and somewhat informative. I'll resend the document so that you guys will have it and you can study it, and I'm certainly interested in your comments. So with that then, we will close our formal service. We will have our final hymn. If you'll please stand and take up your hymnals.